Quick question, if a spell better than Wish was created in D&D 5e, how would that even be possible, and would it need to be banned in order to save the integrity of the game? Wizards of the Coast really outdid themselves this time. So let's talk about how this new spell from Strixhaven is blowing up in D&D subreddits and is somehow more powerful than the literally limitless Wish spell at just first level. Well, for starters, it isn't. It's an important distinction that better doesn't necessarily mean more powerful, and while Wish remains the pinnacle of spellcasting ability, it still takes a 9th level spell slot and a hell of a lot of time and effort to acquire. By the time you do get access to Wish, your campaign will likely be coming to a close, that is, if your adventure even gets that far along. By contrast, this newcomer 1st level spell could be a staple for you throughout your quests so long as you're playing a bard, a sorcerer, or a wizard. Introduced in a Curriculum of Chaos, I present to you Silvery Barbs. This enchantment spell can be used as a reaction whenever a creature within its 60-foot range succeeds on an ability check, saving throw, or an attack roll, distracting the creature and forcing them to re-roll the dice and take the lower roll. At this point, it's important to point out that this is not disadvantage. As you should know, advantage and disadvantage don't stack, but with this spell, it's entirely possible for a creature to succeed with disadvantage and still be forced to re-roll. Statistically, this has a massive implication for the likelihood of succeeding pretty much any DC. So let's take a brief look at the math here. Since this is just a 1st level spell, let's assume that your target is trying to make a DC 13 check. With just disadvantage on a straight roll, there's roughly a 15% chance that they'll make it. That's without modifiers, so I'd say that's pretty reasonable and what we'd expect, right? Now let's give them a +5 modifier, you know, just to be fair. They'd only need to make an 8 to pass the check, and at this point that means a probability of about 42%. Again, I'd say that's pretty expected. After all, a DC 13 check isn't that high, and a +5 modifier is pretty hefty at low levels, especially for a saving throw or an ability check. But just wait. Let's add a 3rd d20 to the mix with Silvery Barbs. The chance of passing a straight roll now plummets down to just over 6%, and the check with modifiers down to about 27%. That's wild, and it gets way worse at higher DCs. But how does this make it the best spell in the game? After all, most of the time, the effect will just boil down to regular disadvantage. To answer that question, let's take a look at a couple of other spells often touted as some of the best in the game. But before that, I'm going to take a break from all the big brain maths and simply remind you to like this video if you're finding all this helpful. Thanks. Now, let's get back to all the broken spell stuff. First up, we have the Shield spell, another 1st level spell that grants you protection from attacks as a reaction by bolstering your AC by 5 until your next turn. It's a great spell to have, but aside from its ability to instantly thwart magic missile, Silvery Barbs is better in almost every way. First of all, Silvery Barbs allows you to protect the rest of your party by casting it on more than just yourself. Secondly, it doesn't just protect against physical attacks, it can keep spell attacks at bay as well. And lastly, it can assist in making sure yours and your allies' spells stick. And it can do all that as a reaction after knowing if the target has succeeded the attack, save, or check. Wouldn't want to waste that 1st level spell slot unnecessarily, though it is worth noting that this does not work on legendary resistances, as has been clarified by Wizards of the Coast since publishing this spell. The whole thing sort of reminds me of Counterspell, in a way. Yes, Counterspell, the spell that has also often been at the center of banning and nerf talks at the game table. Personally, I don't have a problem with it, but this also is a 3rd level spell, and that spell must be cast before knowing the result of the other spell that you'd be countering. Oh, and maybe I should mention that Silvery Barbs has a 2nd half. After imposing a re-roll of a successful check, the user of the spell can then grant advantage to another creature within range on the next attack roll, ability check, or saving throw it makes within a minute. This spell would be powerful enough without this 2nd half, but with it, An enormous power swing is created that holds up even at higher levels. Advantage and disadvantage generally don't get much more or less potent as the game goes on, and this spell does both as a reaction for nearly anything. It's a Swiss Army knife the size of a machete for the cost of a first level spell slot. You can probably see why so many people want this banned or nerfed. After all, literally any character that can take this spell would be better if they did. I wasn't sure how I felt about it at first, since I'm not usually on board for removing player options entirely, but then I thought about something and I realized how I'd be ruling this spell in my own games. I, in fact, will not be removing this spell from my games, and I won't be altering or limiting its usages beyond the need for a single first level spell slot either. Instead, I'm removing it from the spell list for sorcerers and wizards, leaving it only available for bards. Bards have needed a boon in terms of combat ability for some time, and with the Vicious Mockery cantrip being such a staple for the class, it only makes sense that Silvery Barbs would be the next iteration. After all, in large part, bards focus on supporting allies in combat through granting inspiration and other spells like Bane, Fear, Hypnotic Pattern, and Polymorph. And Silvery Barbs is a flagship spell of the College of Eloquence, a very bard-centric school of magic. Obviously, the correct solution will ultimately depend on what your DM decides, but what do you think? Should the spell be banned outright, or do you think another minor change might be implemented down the road to fix this latest power creep in D&D 5e? Let me know down in the comments. And if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our other D&D content. Now, with the most powerful spell in the game at your fingertips, go out there and make some chaos.